Hello, and welcome back. I'm Nicole, a cottage witch. Excuse me, and you may have to excuse my froggy voice sometimes, because I've had a cold all week. But today, so I set out the year, which was like 2 weeks ago when I'm filming this, excuse me, with a couple of goals: to read around the world more, to read more Middle East and North Africa books, and to read more off my bookshelf. And so what I've done for the first couple weeks is just kind of madly and slightly obsessively listen to audiobooks at 2x speed. Sometimes at work, at work when I can, because I work as a data analyst. There are times when I'm able to read at work or listen to things at work, and then sometimes I just have to focus and can't. So it varies, but sometimes I can. And then the rest of the week, so I guess I'm putting this in as a caveat to explain how I've gone through so many books this week, or rather in the first couple weeks of January, because it really is a lot even for me. And I tend to read in the ballpark of 100 books a year, but I'm well ahead of that goal at the moment. Now, I think I've read 3 of these books as physical books, which is more normal. And also it could be like what am I trying to say? I'm not very coherent perhaps with this cold, but basically one of the perks of being an adult is, if you don't have kids anyway, in your free time you can do whatever you want. So I do whatever I want, and I don't tend to do what I feel like I should do anymore. I do what I want to do. Excuse me, sorry. And for the last couple weeks, especially this week when I've been sick, all I wanted to do is lie around playing like puzzle games on my phone and listening to audiobooks. And depending on the narrator, sometimes I'll listen to them at 2x speed. Sometimes not. There's some books that I want to savor. Sometimes audiobook narrators speak more quickly, sometimes they're really slow. And then in that case, I don't mind speeding them up, because if I was just reading the book, I'd read it faster. But with audiobooks, I can do that while I'm like having a shower, doing the dishes, cleaning the bathroom, whatever. All the things. So that's what I've done. So I just wanted to say that to explain how I got through so many books, because I know sometimes in the past I've felt bad comparing myself to other people on Instagram or YouTube who've read more than I have, if I only had the energy to read like 2 books that month. And I just don't want anybody else to feel bad, because this is an unusual month for me. And so that's the set of circumstances. And next month I may read 2 books again, like who knows. So the focus of the first part of this month is sort of in 3 categories. So the first group of books I read, and these are all books I got from the library. The library? Yeah, I think I got these all as library audiobooks. So one of the ways I was trying to get through my shelf faster was listening to finding the ones that I could from the library as audiobooks. And so Zora Neale Hurston's Dust Treks on a Road, which is a sort of memoir of hers, is phenomenal. I love it. She's an incredible writer. Her use of language is exceptional. It's just so good. And so I will definitely be reading it again. She lived a very interesting life. Most of it, I think, the bulk of the book is set in like it starts out with her childhood, so I guess that's the 1890s. But most of it, when she's like remembering her childhood, would be the early 1900s to about 1940 is the bulk of this book. So how she went from just sort of a regular kid in the American South, I think Southish, to being an anthropologist. And her writing is just so... Now, I've read some books by African Americans. I'm Canadian, white Canadian. And so I do not speak the African American vernacular English, obviously. Well, probably obviously. So there could be expressions that are quite common that I'm not familiar with. So kind of with that caveat, the expressions she uses, her use of language is so much fun. And so I don't know to what degree that's, you know, the common language in her community, and to what degree that's her inventiveness with English. But whatever that ratio ends up being, it's so much fun to read. And even the difficult moments in her life, and there were many difficult moments, the writing is so extraordinary. So anyway, that is Dust, Tracks, and Road, which I will keep and reread someday, definitely. Then Ain't I a Woman is a book about Black women and feminism by Bell Hooks. She's a more recent author. When was this written? Looks like the 80s. 81. Okay, so this was first published in 1981. And it is very, obviously, American focused. Starting out with the sort of legacy of slavery on Black folks generally, but Black women specifically. And so it's slightly relative to Canada, because we did have slavery in Canada, which people forget, because in the US it was much more pervasive and dramatic, I guess, and traumatic when there was a war fought over it, and all the nonsense. So there's some, I think, useful information still for Canadians, because I mean, even if slavery wasn't as widespread in Canada, it still existed, and Black folks here are still treated differently, and Indigenous women are still treated very differently. And so I think as a whole, the book is useful for explaining to white women, basically any white woman who's ever asked why feminism should be intersectional should read this book, because it does a really good job of explaining it from the perspective of a Black woman. Now, a perspective of an Indigenous woman in Canada is going to be quite different in terms of the facts of their experiences over the last several hundred years. But the outcome is not so very different. I mean, the outcome of racism is all sorts of things, from disrespect to poverty to increased incarceration, and just, you know, so a lot of the outcomes, there's overlap. So I think even for Canadians, it's a useful book. But yeah, I would recommend this to every white woman I know, I think. Next, I read Maya Angelou's Letter to My Daughter. And, I mean, how do you criticize Maya Angelou? I don't know. She's incredible. I like her books a lot. And this book was a little bit like, I think somewhere it was called a book of essays, but it's not really essays. It's not like, if you've read Roxane Gay's essays, they're not like as distinct and, I don't want to say coherent, but it's not really that sort of book of essays. It really is more like letters and notes and tips and just bits and pieces she's learned along the way that she wants to pass on. And so it's a little bit scattered, and people have criticized it for that. But for what it is, I don't mind that. But if you're expecting, you know, a well curated collection of essays, that's not what this is. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. It's a slim little volume. I don't know that I'll ever read it again, but it was interesting to read once. And then I read Out of the Sun on Race and Storytelling by Esi Edugyan. She is Canadian, and I've actually been to literary events that she's been a part of, and she's a very interesting woman. She wrote a fantastic novel called Washington Black that won all the prizes in Canada that year. And this book sort of, it's slightly similar to Letters to My Daughter in that it sort of bounces, like, flits from idea to idea. It's not, again, it's not a coherent book of essays or anything. It's just sort of her exploring different art, visual art sometimes, books, films. and how race impacts how these various stories are told. So there's a section, she's got some pictures in here, where she talks about how Black people have been portrayed in European art, and how Black people, once they started to be recognized as artists in their own right, were able to portray themselves in similar art forms. So there's this Kahidi Wiley is one of the examples, and the reactions to that, and that sort of thing. And so she does that for film as well, and a little bit in books. It is kind of all over the place. There's not like a strong narrative through line, except for the fact that it's a bunch of ideas about how Black folks have been portrayed in various media, usually in the West, usually originally by white people and then by themselves. So that was kind of interesting. And then the next section of books I read were memoirs. So one of the first books that I tried to read and didn't finish, so I don't have it because I put it in a free little library, is a biography of Edna St. Vincent Millay by Nancy Milford. It's called Savage Beauty. And I thought I would like it because I love her sonnets. Her sonnets are amazing. They're gorgeous. And I absolutely adore them. But the book was a bit of a slog to get through. I got about halfway through and gave up. And I decided I didn't much like the writing because it went too much into every single detail of her life. Like, it could have been several hundred pages shorter, and not lost much for that. But I also wasn't really sure I liked her as a person. So I decided, nope, I'll stop that. I won't finish it, and I'll just appreciate her poetry. Then I listened to this audiobook, which I loved, which is a biography of Frida Kahlo by Hayden Herrera. And I saw the movie, which must have come out about 20 years ago now, a long time ago, which was incredible, and I loved it, and I should watch it again sometime. I wonder if you can watch it on, like, streaming platforms anywhere. I'll look it up. Obviously, as you can tell from this particular cover, Selma Hayek was Frida, and she did an exceptional job. Although I think she's much sort of, like, conventionally prettier than the actual Frida, who had a much more, less classically pretty, but very interesting face, which she painted herself many, many times. So I'd always wanted to read this book and just had never gotten to it. But she had such an extraordinary life of many, many difficult things. Some of her paintings are a bit graphic, so, you know, avert your eyes if you're sensitive to that sort of thing. But she'd been through a lot of pain and suffering with accidents and illness, and then complications from the accident and various miscarriages and whatnot. So there's a lot in her fairly dramatic relationship with Diego Rivera. But it was so interesting. So, you know, I don't usually reread memoirs, but I may reread this someday. She just had such an interesting life. She was such an interesting person, and her painting I love. So here's some of her paintings in color. She did a lot of self-portraits, and then various other, sometimes slightly gruesome. A lot of her work focused on her body and how broken and in pain it was all the time, or much of the time. And yeah, so that was incredible. Loved that one. Then I read The Glass Castle, which was, her life also was very dramatic and very chaotic and very painful. Her childhood was a disaster. Her parents are like, on the one hand, I kind of sympathize a bit with their ideals. On the other hand, they really were terrible parents. Like, they did not provide the basic necessities of life for their children in terms of, like, food and clothes and shelter. it was abysmal. And so she struggled a lot. But she and all of her siblings, as far as the book portrays them all, were really creative in terms of figuring out how to survive. And so that was quite an interesting book. And next I listened to, and this could count, I guess, for my read around the world, because I think she was from Romania originally. And of course the borders changed and she was in Hungary. But she was born in Romania. She was a Jewish young woman who was, I think, I want to say in the ballpark of like 15 when the Second World War broke out, or maybe even younger. And her family was Jewish. And so they survived the first, throughout the 30s. She worked as a seamstress, like going to school to become a seamstress. And then worked apparently on really fancy people's clothes in Romania. In, what's the capital? Bucharest? Is that the capital? I always get the capitals of Romania and Hungary mixed up. I'm terrible. Apologies to any Romanians or Hungarians. But anyway, and then her parents lived in the country. And at one point, when the military started dictating where Jews could go, you can't go on the trains, you have to whatever, all this sort of nonsense, she had to sneak back to her family, partly on foot, because they lived in the country. So she lived with her parents again for a while. And they just sort of a subsistence lifestyle is what they had, I guess, for a while, until people started rounding up the Jews. And so eventually she and her father were taken. Her father ended up dying in prison, and she was released for a while. And then she and some of her relatives and friends moved to a city in Hungary, I believe, because they didn't cross the border crossed them. And of course they paid for it, as you do. Mexicans can probably attest to that, or Californians, or Hispanic people in Texas. But anyway, at one point, she could only get work by pretending to be a Gentile, because she could pass as not, because she didn't have stereotypically Jewish features that some of her other family members did. But then eventually they were all rounded up one day and marched off to a train, and then another train, and I think another march somewhere in between. They worked in labor around the city, like in the fields and stuff, for a while, and then she ended up in Ravensbrück with, I think, a sister and a friend or a cousin. I can't remember the relationships exactly, but it's an interesting story because it's told in such a matter-of-fact, sort of ordinary, this is just what happened sort of way. But it's a pretty extreme situation for all three of those girls. Well, 4 originally, and then one of them didn't survive. But for the 3 surviving girls, 2 have survived. So eventually, they were freed in Germany, and she was in hospital for a while. Well, they were all in hospital for a while because they were pretty malnourished and had all sorts of issues, as will happen in a concentration camp. And then eventually she and her husband, who she met while she was recovering, were accepted into the U.S. So this is her story from her kinda, not early childhood, but like school age childhood to about the time she moved to the U.S. So it's pretty interesting. It's weird to say you like a book about the Holocaust, because how do you like a book about the Holocaust? But it was really good. And then I read Ordinary Girls by Jaquira Díaz. And this could also be one of the read around the world. It actually is added to my world map for Puerto Rico, which I realize is technically a territory of the U.S., but maybe it should be their own country. Who knows? But, I mean, I say who knows, because I'm pretty sure I do know, but also I don't need anybody coming after me for saying that. That being said, she lived an extraordinary life. Even though it's called Ordinary Girls, it's funny. It made me think about how there really are no ordinary, boring people. Like, boring people, I just don't think exist. I mean, sometimes I think I'm boring, but maybe I'm just boring to me or other people sometimes, but I don't think there's any, like, inherently boring people. And so this is her story of growing up, first in Puerto Rico and then in Miami, and the girls that she sort of ran with, and she lived sort of as a street kid for a while. Her parents were very ill-equipped to be parents. They did not do right by her. They did, in terms of anything from, usually there was a roof over her head, but it was not like a loving home, you couldn't say, really. It was very dramatic. And she went to juvenile detention for, I can't remember for what, but she and some of the friends she had from school got into some trouble and then got themselves out of it. And so this is her sort of series of adventures in her life, which, she calls herself and her friends ordinary girls at several points in the book. But I don't know, maybe they are, but also they're pretty extraordinary. Not all of them survived, between like drug addiction and things like that. Not everybody kind of made it, quote unquote, but she did. She's made a good life for herself now, and the things that she has survived are just so interesting, because I think I put this on Instagram, but she's about as different a person from me as I can imagine there being. So, but that's kind of why I like to read books by other people, because otherwise I wouldn't have known anything about experiences of girls like her. And so that's part of my reason for reading around the world, is to learn more about people's experiences outside of my own. Okay. This is my one fiction book that sort of fits into the extraordinary women writers, because have these all been women so far? They have, all of them. All right, apparently this is the month for reading mostly women, at least so far. The Wind Knows My Name by Isabel Allende. She's a favorite author of mine. I love her. I've always loved her for like 20 years. I will always read all of her books. This one I liked. I couldn't say it's one of my favorites ever, but I liked it. It was a good one. Like, solid. And I'm glad I read it. And it's focuses on the experiences of people who, well, at first, one of the characters was on the Kinder transport to the UK during this Second World War. And then another girl her mom was seeking asylum in the US across the Mexican border, and then she was separated from her mom in that absolutely horrific Trump policy, which apparently was a policy before that, but he made, oh God, I don't know what to say about that other than it's horrifying. Anyway, that's the sort of historical backdrop for the novel. I think maybe the scope was a bit broad for the book. Like, there were a few too many characters for me to try and keep track of. And sometimes I wouldn't remember. By the time it got back around to some of the characters again, I wouldn't remember where I'd previously heard of them in the novel. So it was a bit hard to follow in that way, but it was very moving. Some people didn't like the little girl section. I really did. She was a sweet girl, and when you have to survive horrifying things, like, it changes people, and you do what you have to survive, so she did. And that was a pretty interesting one. I liked it. Then I read another book, The Beekeeper of Aleppo, which I've actually given to a Frida library as well, so I don't have it with me, but it is in my Read Around the World challenge, she's from Cyprus, I believe, which is like Middle East adjacent because they speak a form of Arabic there, even though it's in Europe. And it was really good. It was like kind of like Nadia Hashimi and Khalid Hosseini's books, like The Kite Runner, stuff like that, a little bit. I don't think it was quite as good as those books, but it was good. It was the main couple are from Syria, and they're so sweet. They're just an adorable couple who are perfectly ordinary people who've ended up in the most horrifying situation. And it's sort of it's ostensibly their journey from Syria to Greece to the UK. But you know they make it to the UK eventually because it jumps around a bit. So that's not a spoiler, but it's more about their emotional journey, dealing with the loss they suffer in Syria and how that affects them psychologically, how it affects their relationship with each other. And yeah, it was really sweet. It was very sad, but it was very sweet. And then, this is one of those books for trying to learn French that I listened to and read mostly at the same time, which is Moi Malala, I Am Malala. So I'd read this in English years ago, I think when it first came out, and or pretty close to. And then I found this one in French and thought, I'll give it a go. And then I realized that the French audiobook is the same text, almost entirely, which doesn't always happen with translations into French. Sometimes the audiobook and the printed copy use different translations, which is maddening as a language learner. Because what I like to do is read and listen at the same time when I can. At the end of it, I just listened. And I did, it's either more advanced than Harry Potter, or I'm just not as familiar with the content of it, because it was a bit hard to follow when I just listened to it. Because I'm not fluent. Like, I say I read and listen to these. That doesn't mean I'm fluent in French. I'm very much not. So this was like learning material to practice and see how much I could understand. And also, because your brain picks things up when you're trying to understand something, and then it starts to recognize patterns and things. So that was the goal with that one, which was lovely. And then, so this is the sort of third group, I guess, of books, which is books from the Middle East, North Africa. So, obviously, she's from Pakistan. Next is a woman from Palestine. I think she was actually born in Kuwait, but her parents are Palestinian refugees. And this is Mornings in Jeannette, and it is beautiful. I loved it. I'll read Loveless something or other. I can't remember the title of her latest book, but my library has the audiobook version, so I've reserved it, because all of her books have really good ratings on Goodreads. They're all 4 point something or other, and it was so moving. And again, in this one, I think the scope was maybe a bit optimistic in terms of like what one book could deliver, but it was the first book in a while to make me cry. Like, it's heartbreaking. So yeah, highly recommend this one. Basically, it's a family who live in Jenin refugee camp in the West Bank. And it's I guess you could say a multi-generational book, although one girl is sort of the main character. At the start, it's hard to tell she's going to be the main character because you're trying to keep track of too many characters, but Amal is basically becomes the main character. It's a tiny bit slow to start, but it really gets going and is a beautiful book. Highly recommend. All right, then I listened to Daring to Drive. Oops, I'm wrecking my puzzle. I'm getting a puzzle board one of these days that has like a cover that you can work on, which will be lovely because I only have so much surface space. So this is dual purpose surface at the moment. Anyway, Daring to Drive. Manal al-Sharif was, is a Saudi woman who, I think she has to live outside of Saudi Arabia now because she's annoyed the Saudi officials a little bit beyond their limits and she doesn't want to end up in jail again, because she did, for driving. Because there isn't technically a law in Saudi Arabia that prohibits women from driving, but it's custom that women are not allowed to drive. And so she didn't technically break a law, but they made up a whole bunch of charges against her anyway and arrested her. And eventually she was released, but sort of had to leave the country. And it became really difficult because when she left, her son is still in the country with her ex-husband. But her new son, with her new husband, is not allowed. The Saudi government won't grant him a visa to go into Saudi Arabia. So the two brothers have never actually met each other except on like Zoom or that type of thing. So it's a heck of a story. I mean, you'd think driving is such a small, ordinary thing, even though I don't drive. But you know, people drive every day to work and whatever, and nobody thinks twice about it. But it really does contribute in Saudi Arabia to keeping women imprisoned. Like, if you can't afford a driver and you don't want to get in a car with a random stranger, then you're trapped in your home until your husband or brother or uncle or whoever can drive you somewhere. And so there's a sort of home as prison situation for a lot of women. And she decided to drive anyway. And she videotaped herself, her friend videotaped her, recorded her, whatever, and put it on YouTube, I think, or Twitter or something. Anyway, social media of some description. And so many people around the world watched it. Most of the comments were negative by Saudi men who really seem to despise this woman just for driving. It's so bizarre. Like, for when religious people of any religion, Christianity, Islam, whatever, say they want to protect women by controlling them, you just know they don't respect women. They just don't. It's terrible. So anyway, she was extraordinary. And then the only two men on the list are these two. So Prison Time in Sana'a by Abdul Qadir al-Guneid. Not sure I pronounced that properly. He is Yemeni. So he was a doctor. He lives in Canada now, but he was a doctor in Yemen who was arrested for what he posted on Twitter, basically. He spoke out against the government and against the Houthi movement and probably against Al-Qaeda, and nobody in the government liked that. So I think it was a Houthi prison that he ended up being in, because there were Salah supporters, government supporters, who were also in prison, and then Al-Qaeda members who were also in prison. And it was just a really interesting group of people that he was in prison with, like people who were very different from him, some of whom had actually committed crimes, like seriously violent Al-Qaeda type crimes. But it was interesting listening to him recount just talking to these various people. So most of the book is just hit the conversations he had with his various cellmates throughout the time that he was incarcerated. And there's a little political history of Yemen at the back, but that's a bit of drudgery to get through. I think the stories in the middle of the book, which is the bulk of the book, are more interesting, but also communicate more information about the current state of affairs there, which is honestly kind of a nightmare for most people. So that's that one, and that was my first book I'd ever read by a Yemeni author. And then the first book I ever read by a Libyan author is The Return by Hisham Matar. So his father was a political opponent of Muammar Gaddafi, and they escaped to Egypt and lived there for a while. But then eventually, Egyptian authorities kidnapped his father and gave them back to Libyan authorities, and his father disappeared into one of Gaddafi's prisons, never to be heard from. Well, I'd say never to be heard from again. He never got out, and I don't know what happened to him. For a while, they got letters that were smuggled out, and then that just stopped. And literally nobody's heard from him since. Like, nobody knows where he is, if he's dead, if he's not. Nobody knows. So when the Arab Spring happened, he went back to Libya with his family, and that was the first time they could safely return, or mostly safely-ish. So he went and tried to look for his father, and also met various other members of his family. A couple of his uncles had been in prison for like 20 years as political prisoners, not because they committed crimes, but their crime was not liking Gaddafi, basically, which was enough, I guess. And so yeah, that was pretty interesting. I'd never read a book by a Libyan author before, so I was happy to get this one on my list. It was not the most like thrilling, fast-paced sort of book to read. It's very contemplative and a little bit plotting, because he's a bit uncertain of what steps he even wants to take. Like, does he even want to know what happened to his father? Yes, he does, but also, it's messy. So, that's that one. And the only other thing I wanted to talk about in this video was just to touch on what it was like when I started reading books by specifically women from the Middle East. Because part of this Read Around the World challenge, part of what happens is you come across books that even though they're translated into English, they're not written for a Western audience. They're certainly not written for a white Canadian audience or a white American audience. And so it can, depending on your experience with reading international books, it can be a bit difficult at first. So, for example, Aria by Nazanin Hozar. She's Canadian, well, Iranian Canadian. I don't actually know if she was born in Iran or Canada, but it hardly matters because she's both. I mean, maybe it matters to her, I don't know. But this book is set in Iran, and it was part of a book club that I went to a few years back. And part of the conversation around this book revolved around the fact that a lot of the women, who were almost entirely white women in the group, didn't understand the motivations of the characters. They didn't understand the choices she made, this main character, Aria. And I realized at that point that I'd gotten used enough to reading Iranian authors that to me her motivations actually did make sense. The character portrayal seemed reasonable to me. It seems Iranian. It does not seem Canadian. And so there's a bit of a lost in translation moment where the words are all translated into English. But if you haven't read a lot from Iran, for example, there's cultural context that you just don't have. Even if you watch the news occasionally, the news is not portraying people as three-dimensional human beings. And it's not really giving you a lot of cultural context. It's mostly giving you what the Americans are afraid of. Which is not Iran. You know, like, it's a few people in charge of Iran at the moment who are bonkers and horrifying men, but it's not most people. And so part of the reason I started reading books from the Middle East was to counter those sorts of narratives in the lead up to the war in Iraq, and then I branched out to elsewhere in the Middle East. But I did just want to mention that in case anybody else tries to read more books in translation, that is something to keep in mind, that even though you may follow the words because they're all in English, there may be cultural context that means you just don't get everything. You know? It just might not make sense to you as a Canadian or American reader or whatever, because you just don't know. And I think that sometimes happens with Indigenous authors or African American authors as well, especially authors like Toni Morrison. I've read, I think, all of her novels now. But the first couple I read were, on the one hand, amazing. On the other hand, I did not have the cultural context for those at that point. And she very explicitly stated that she did not write for a white audience. So it was a cultural context that I needed to slowly acquire. And one of the interesting things about reading around the world is it does sort of expand your mind. Like, it feels like the world cracks open a little bit more, and you understand a little bit more about this corner and that corner of the world and the people in it. And the people in it are so interesting. And so this is one of the first books I read from the Middle East. This is Women of Sand and Myrrh by Hanan al-Shaykh. She is Lebanese, I think. Is she Lebanese? This book is set in a Middle Eastern country that's quite obviously Saudi Arabia. But I think she's Lebanese. But it's an unnamed country for probably political reasons. But it's definitely, in my view, Saudi Arabia. But it was hard to read at first because I didn't really know. It's not just the historical context that I didn't know. It's that Arab women don't take the same approach to writing novels that Canadian women do. It's just different. Western novels and Middle Eastern novels are not the same. And that's neither a good nor a bad thing. It's just a thing. And so this book I struggled through. I liked, like, intellectually, I liked it. Emotionally, I didn't understand it. Because I just didn't know enough at that point. I should reread it sometime and see if I feel differently about it now. Because I think I read it probably like 15 years ago. It's not a new book. But yeah, so I just wanted to sort of end with that if you ever venture into reading authors in translation, that is something to keep in mind, that there may be things that you don't understand that aren't a fault of the book. They're just due to the fact that we are different people from different parts of the country, and our literary traditions are also quite different. So on that note, those are my books of up to January, 17th, as I'm filming this. I'll probably post this next week. That's that. If you made it this far, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.